The streets of New York City, once dominated by horse-drawn carriages and trolleys, had transformed into rivers of gleaming metal and roaring engines by 1930. Japanese diplomat Kensuke Horinuchi stood transfixed at the intersection of Fifth Avenue and 42nd Street, watching in disbelief as an endless procession of automobiles, Fords, Chevrolets, Packards, and Cadillacs, streamed past in dizzying numbers. "It is as if Americans have forgotten how to walk," he wrote in his diplomatic cable that evening. "The automobile is not merely transportation here, it is the beating heart of American civilization itself." Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now, let's get to the story. The cultural shock experienced by Japanese diplomats witnessing America's automotive revolution of the 1920s and early 1930s represents one of history's most profound technological divides between two rising powers. While the streets of Tokyo in 1930 still echoed with the clip-clop of horse hooves and the quiet whisper of rickshaws, America had already transformed into a nation on wheels. This stark contrast would ultimately reshape global industrial competition, influence military preparation heading into World War II, and forever alter how these two Pacific powers viewed each other's industrial capabilities. The America that greeted Japanese diplomatic missions in the late 1920s and early 1930s was experiencing what historians now recognize as the first great democratization of automotive transportation. Henry Ford's revolutionary manufacturing techniques had transformed the automobile from a luxury item for the wealthy into a practical necessity for the middle class. By 1927, Ford had produced over 15 million Model Ts, and when Japanese diplomats arrived for crucial trade negotiations in 1930, they encountered a nation where 1 in 5 Americans owned an automobile, a ratio that would have seemed like science fiction in Japan. Ambassador Katsuji Debuchy, who presented his credentials to President Herbert Hoover in February 1929, kept meticulous records of his impressions of American industrial might. His personal journals, later preserved in the diplomatic archives of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan, reveal his astonishment. The common worker drives to his factory job. The shopkeeper has a delivery truck. Even farmers possess automobiles. This is not transportation as we understand it. This is an entirely new relationship between humans and machines that has transformed American society down to its foundations. The scale of America's automotive industry in 1929 was indeed staggering. General Motors and Ford were producing millions of vehicles annually in massive factory complexes like Detroit's River Rouge plant, which employed over 100,000 workers and incorporated all aspects of automobile production from raw materials to finished vehicles. When a delegation of Japanese industrial observers toured these facilities in October 1930, they described industrial cathedrals where steel and rubber are transformed into mobility with almost religious efficiency. What made this observation particularly significant was its timing. The delegation arrived just as the effects of the 1929 stock market crash were beginning to ripple through the American economy. Yet even as economic uncertainty loomed, the Japanese visitors noted that automobile ownership remained seemingly non-negotiable for Americans. Even as they worry about their bank accounts, Americans cling to their automobiles, noted economic attaché Tadao Wikawa. They will sacrifice other expenses before relinquishing their cars. This speaks to how deeply the automobile has penetrated American identity. The American automotive landscape of 1930 represented more than just impressive statistics. It showcased a profound cultural transformation that the Japanese observers struggled to comprehend. America had reoriented its entire civilization around the automobile with remarkable speed. Cities had expanded into sprawling suburbs. Businesses had relocated to accommodate driving customers. New industries had emerged to service the automotive ecosystem: gas stations, repair shops, roadside restaurants, and motels dotted the expanding network of roads that connected formerly isolated communities. This transformation was particularly evident in California, where Japanese diplomats frequently traveled between San Francisco and Los Angeles. Consul General Tomokazu Hori described the journey in a 1931 report. The American West has been conquered not by railroads, but by automobiles. Families travel great distances as casually as we might walk to a neighborhood shop. They think nothing of driving hundreds of miles for business or pleasure. Their relationship with distance has been fundamentally altered. The proliferation of automobiles had transformed not just transportation, but American social life itself. Dating customs evolved around car ownership, with young couples finding privacy in automobiles. Family vacations became road trips to national parks. Work and home could be separated by many miles, fundamentally changing urban development. Japanese observers noted that Americans increasingly defined freedom itself in automotive terms: the ability to go where one wanted, when one wanted, without depending on public schedules or routes. This freedom of movement represented a stark contrast to Japan's more structured society. Americans appear almost nomadic compared to Japanese, wrote cultural attaché Hideo Kitamura after visiting Los Angeles in 1932. Their willingness to relocate for opportunity, their comfort with great distances, their independence from fixed transit. These qualities are inseparable from their automobile culture and explain much about their national character. The automotive revolution that so astonished Japanese observers was the culmination of several uniquely American factors converging at a pivotal historical moment. The vast geographic expanse of the United States created natural demand for efficient transportation. America's abundant natural resources, particularly oil, rubber, and steel, provided the raw materials for mass production. The nation's advanced financial system made consumer credit widely available, allowing middle-class families to purchase vehicles on installment plans. And perhaps most importantly, American industrial visionaries like Henry Ford and Alfred Sloan had developed revolutionary production and management techniques that dramatically reduced manufacturing costs. Ford's moving assembly line, introduced in 1913, had transformed automobile production from a craft practiced by skilled workers into a precisely choreographed industrial process. By the time Japanese industrial observers toured American factories in 1930, the system had evolved into an industrial symphony of remarkable efficiency. Each worker performed a specialized task as vehicles moved continuously down the line. The Japanese delegation measured the output. A new Ford rolled off the assembly line every 10 seconds. We are witnessing not just manufacturing, but a form of industrial magic, wrote one observer. The Americans have developed production techniques that must be seen to be believed. General Motors, under Alfred Sloan's leadership, had taken a different approach, creating a range of automobile brands at various price points, from affordable Chevrolets to prestigious Cadillacs, while standardizing components across models to maintain manufacturing efficiency. This strategy allowed consumers to trade up as their economic circumstances improved, while keeping production costs manageable. Japanese industrial experts recognized this approach as particularly significant. The Americans have solved a puzzle we still struggle with, noted industrial observer Kiichiro Toyota, who would later found the Toyota Motor Corporation. They have created standardization without uniformity, efficiency without sacrificing consumer choice. The Japanese diplomatic corps had been tasked with understanding America's industrial might. As tensions grew between the two Pacific powers in the early 1930s, their reports on America's automotive industry went far beyond mere technical observations. They recognized that mass automobile ownership represented a fundamentally different relationship between citizens, industry, and government than existed in Japan. In America, private industry had created an automotive ecosystem with minimal government involvement, responding primarily to consumer demand. This contrasted sharply with Japan's more coordinated industrial development approach, where government played a central guiding role. This difference was especially evident in road development. By 1930, America had embarked on massive road-building programs at both state and federal levels, largely in response to pressure from automobile owners and to industry groups like the American Automobile Association. Japanese observers noted that roads were being built in advance of settlement in many regions, essentially creating new communities through automotive connectivity. Americans build roads not just to connect existing places, but to create new possibilities, wrote transportation attaché Ichiro Kono. The road itself becomes an invitation to expansion. The impact of America's automotive revolution extended far beyond transportation. Japanese diplomatic reports devoted considerable attention to how automobiles had transformed American retail. Traditional urban shopping districts were being complemented, and sometimes replaced, by new automobile-oriented commercial developments. Department stores built large parking facilities. New drive-in businesses emerged that allowed consumers to make purchases without leaving their vehicles. Mail-order companies expanded their operations to serve far-flung automotive communities. The automotive supply chain itself had become one of America's largest economic sectors, employing millions in related industries. Steel mills, rubber manufacturers, glass factories, textile mills, and countless component suppliers had oriented their operations around automotive production. Oil companies had expanded dramatically, with refineries and gas stations becoming ubiquitous features of the American landscape. Japanese industrial observers calculated that for every worker directly employed in automobile manufacturing, at least 3 more worked in supportive industries. This vast industrial ecosystem represented a form of economic resilience that particularly concerned Japanese military attachés. Captain Taman Yamaguchi, who would later command aircraft carriers in the Pacific War, toured Detroit manufacturing facilities in 1931 and reported to Tokyo. America's automotive industry represents a latent military production capacity of staggering proportions. Factories producing civilian vehicles could be converted to military production with relative ease. The technical workforce already possesses the necessary skills for manufacturing mechanized war equipment. This industrial base provides America with strategic advantages that cannot be matched by numerical military superiority alone. The social implications of mass automobile ownership were equally significant to Japanese observers. In contrast to Japan's more hierarchical society, America's automotive culture seemed to blur class distinctions. Assembly line workers could, through installment purchasing, own the same basic model of car as their supervisors. Rural farmers and urban professionals shared the same roads. This democratization of mobility represented a form of practical equality that made a deep impression on Japanese diplomats accustomed to more visible status distinctions. The automobile in America represents not just transportation, but a form of social leveling, wrote social affairs attaché Kenzo Takayanagi. This creates a form of everyday egalitarianism that influences American perceptions of social hierarchy in ways we Japanese find difficult to fully comprehend. By 1932, Japanese diplomatic and industrial observations had crystallized into a clear recognition. America's automotive revolution represented not just a technological achievement, but a comprehensive transformation of society that gave the United States significant advantages in industrial capacity, resource utilization, workforce development, and military potential. When encountered on the road, citizens of vastly different social positions appear remarkably similar, each in command of their own machine, each navigating shared space according to common rules. Most concerning to Japanese observers was the self-reinforcing nature of this transformation. Automobile ownership created demand for better roads, which enabled more automobile travel, which stimulated more automobile purchases, creating an accelerating cycle of industrial expansion. This recognition informed Japan's strategic thinking as relations between the two nations deteriorated throughout the 1930s. Japanese military planners understood that a prolonged conflict with the United States would ultimately become a contest between industrial systems, with America's automotive industry providing a foundation for military production that Japan could not match. This realization influenced Japan's strategic emphasis on naval and air power that could potentially neutralize American industrial advantages through decisive early victories. The automotive gap between Japan and the United States was thrown into stark relief by production statistics that Japanese industrial observers carefully collected. In 1930, as Japanese diplomats watched America's streets fill with automobiles, the United States produced over 4.5 million vehicles, one for every 27 Americans. Japan, by contrast, produced fewer than 500 vehicles that year, approximately one for every 120,000 Japanese citizens. Even accounting for imported vehicles, automobile ownership in Japan remained largely limited to government agencies, wealthy individuals, and commercial enterprises. This enormous disparity was not merely a matter of industrial capacity, but reflected fundamental differences in economic development, infrastructure, urban design, and cultural attitudes toward transportation. Japanese cities had developed around pedestrian movement and rail transportation with narrow streets unsuited to heavy automobile traffic. Japan's limited domestic oil resources made the nation dependent on imported petroleum, and Japanese wages had not reached levels that made mass automobile ownership economically feasible for most citizens. Yet Japanese observers recognized that automobile ownership represented more than practical transportation. It had become a cornerstone of America's consumer culture and a symbol of its industrial modernity. Ambassador Debussy noted this symbolic dimension in a 1932 report. The automobile has become so central to American life that citizens appear to measure national progress and personal success through automotive metrics. They speak constantly of horsepower, speed, and model years. Automotive language permeates their conversation, even when discussing matters unrelated to transportation. The automobile has become both the method and the metaphor of American advancement. This observation proved particularly prescient. As the Great Depression deepened, American automotive manufacturers responded not by retreating, but by accelerating the pace of innovation and marketing. Annual model changes, pioneered by General Motors, transformed the automobile from a durable good into a fashion item subject to cycles of obsolescence and replacement. Streamlined designs, new comfort features, and mechanical improvements were heavily advertised to stimulate consumer desire for the latest models. Japanese commercial attachés noted with particular interest how automobile marketing had evolved into a sophisticated science of consumer persuasion. American automotive advertisements rarely focus on practical transportation, wrote Shigeo Nakamura in 1933. Instead, they sell dreams of status, freedom, power, and modernity. The automobile is presented not as something one needs, but as something one desires, a visible demonstration of personal success and participation in American progress. This marketing sophistication extended to financing arrangements that made automobile ownership possible for millions of American families even during economic hardship. By 1930, approximately three-quarters of all automobile purchases in the United States involved installment credit, a financial innovation that Japanese observers recognized as critical to mass consumption. The Americans have developed a system where possession precedes full payment, noted financial attaché Hisato Ichimada. This creates immediate access to goods that would otherwise require years of saving. The psychological and economic effects of this approach cannot be overstated. The relationship between America's automotive culture and its petroleum industry particularly concerned Japanese observers, who recognized their nation's strategic vulnerability in oil resources. By the early 1930s, the United States produced approximately 60% of the world's petroleum, with American companies controlling significant portions of global oil production. This abundance of domestic oil had enabled America's automotive explosion while simultaneously creating a strategic resource advantage that Japan could not match. America's streets flow with automobiles because American wells flow with oil, wrote resource analyst Masayoshi Kato in a confidential 1932 assessment. This fundamental equation defines not just transportation policy, but strategic reality. A nation dependent on imported petroleum for basic mobility operates under constraints that petroleum-rich nations do not share. This single resource disparity may prove more significant than any other factor in determining the future balance of power in the Pacific. As Japanese diplomatic and industrial observers compiled their assessments of America's automotive revolution between 1929 and 1933, a complex picture emerged that went far beyond counting vehicles or measuring industrial output. They recognized that the automobile had fundamentally altered American society in ways that created both immediate commercial opportunities and long-term strategic challenges for Japan. On the commercial front, America's automotive boom represented a potential export market for Japanese manufacturers who could adapt to American consumer preferences. Several Japanese industrial delegations specifically studied the emerging market for smaller, more economical vehicles that might complement America's predominantly large, powerful automobiles. These observations would later influence Japan's post-war automotive export strategy, which focused initially on compact, fuel-efficient vehicles for the American market. Strategically, however, the observations painted a more challenging picture. Japanese military analysts calculated that America's automotive industry could produce approximately 30 times more vehicles annually than Japan's entire industrial base. More concerning, this production capacity could be converted to military purposes with relative ease. Automobile factories could produce tanks, aircraft engines, and other mechanized war equipment, while the technical workforce already possessed the necessary manufacturing skills. This recognition contributed to Japan's emphasis on naval power and aviation as potential counterweights to America's industrial advantages. If conflict became inevitable, Japanese strategic thinking focused on neutralizing American industrial capacity through decisive early victories, rather than engaging in a prolonged war of attrition that would inevitably favor the United States. The cultural dimensions of America's automotive revolution proved equally significant to Japanese observers. They noted how automobile ownership had fostered a distinctly American approach to mobility, privacy, and independence that contrasted sharply with Japan's more collective transportation traditions. Americans appeared to value personal movement and private space in ways that Japanese society had not traditionally emphasized. The American automobile represents not just transportation, but a mobile private domain, wrote cultural observer Tadao Fujikawa in 1933. Inside their vehicles, Americans create personal environments, separated from public space, yet capable of traversing it. This combination of privacy and mobility seems to satisfy deeply held American values that may not translate directly to Japanese society. This cultural analysis proved remarkably insightful. When Japan began its own automotive expansion in the post-war period, Japanese manufacturers adapted their designs to reflect domestic preferences for efficient use of space, fuel economy, and integration with public transportation systems rather than simply imitating American automotive values. By early 1934, as international tensions continued to rise and Japan's military influence grew within its government, the diplomatic observations of America's automotive culture took on increasing strategic significance. Military planners incorporated these assessments into their strategic calculations, recognizing that any potential Pacific conflict would ultimately pit Japan's limited industrial base against America's vast manufacturing capacity, with the automotive industry forming a crucial component of this disparity. This recognition influenced Japan's emphasis on quality over quantity in military equipment, particularly in naval and aviation technology, where qualitative advantages might potentially offset America's quantitative superiority. It also shaped Japan's resource acquisition strategy in the Pacific, with petroleum security becoming an increasingly central concern as the prospect of conflict with Western powers grew more likely. For their part, American officials remained largely unaware of how thoroughly Japanese diplomatic and industrial observers had studied and analyzed their automotive ecosystem. While American intelligence monitored Japan's naval construction and military movements throughout the early 1930s, little attention was paid to Japanese industrial observers touring automotive plants, attending auto shows, and meticulously documenting America's transportation transformation. This intelligence asymmetry would prove significant in the years ahead. Japan developed its war plans with a clear understanding of America's industrial capacity and conversion potential, while American military planners initially underestimated Japan's technical capabilities and strategic planning. The automotive gap between the nations represented just one aspect of this broader intelligence picture, but Japanese observations of America's four-wheeled revolution provided valuable insights into industrial capacity, resource utilization, and social organization that informed strategic thinking as the world moved toward global conflict. As 1934 dawned, the streets of American cities continued to fill with automobiles of increasing sophistication and power. Japanese diplomats and industrial observers continued their careful documentation of this phenomenon, even as political relations between the two Pacific powers grew increasingly strained. The automotive gap they observed represented more than transportation statistics. It revealed fundamental differences in industrial development, resource availability, consumer culture, and strategic position that would help shape the coming Pacific conflict. In Tokyo, planners studied these reports with growing concern, recognizing that America's automotive revolution had created industrial advantages that would prove difficult to overcome through conventional military means. The profound question that haunted Japanese strategic planners as they reviewed these reports was stark. How could a nation with one automobile per 120,000 citizens possibly challenge a nation with one automobile per 27 citizens in a prolonged industrial war? The answer would reshape the Pacific world for generations to come. While Japanese observers marveled at America's automotive transformation, the industrial implications of this revolution extended far beyond transportation alone. By early 1934, America's automotive ecosystem had evolved into a sophisticated industrial complex that Japanese analysts recognized as a fundamental strategic advantage. The assembly lines of Detroit had become not just production facilities, but laboratories for manufacturing innovation, developing techniques that could be applied across industrial sectors. Particularly significant was the standardization of parts and processes that made mass production possible. Japanese industrial observers noted that American automotive manufacturers had achieved remarkable precision in component manufacturing, with interchangeable parts produced to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. This standardization enabled not just efficient automobile production, but created transferable manufacturing knowledge that could be applied to other industrial sectors, including military equipment. The precision manufacturing techniques developed for automobile production represent industrial knowledge of enormous strategic value, wrote industrial attaché Yoshisuke Aikawa in February 1934. American workers and engineers have developed skills and methods that can be applied to any complex mechanical production. The automobile has essentially trained an industrial workforce capable of producing sophisticated machinery of any type, including weapons of war. This observation proved prophetic. When America later converted its automotive plants to military production during World War II, the transition occurred with remarkable speed precisely because the fundamental manufacturing processes remained similar. Automobile engines and tank engines required comparable machining skills. Sheet metal stamping techniques worked for both car bodies and aircraft components. Assembly line organization principles applied equally to civilian and military production. Japanese observers also noted the sophisticated industrial ecosystem that had developed around automobile production. By 1934, the American automotive supply chain included thousands of specialized component manufacturers, material suppliers, and service providers organized in a complex industrial network. This decentralized production system provided remarkable resilience and adaptability that centralized manufacturing lacked. The Americans have developed not just automobile factories, but an automobile manufacturing ecosystem, noted engineering observer Taizo Ishida in March 1934. Components flow from hundreds of specialized suppliers into final assembly plants. This distributed manufacturing approach allows for rapid adaptation and remarkable production flexibility that our more centralized industrial model cannot easily match. This industrial ecosystem extended to workforce development as well. American automotive manufacturers had pioneered systematic technical training programs that transformed unskilled laborers into specialized industrial workers. Japanese observers noted that Detroit's automotive plants operated sophisticated apprenticeship programs, technical schools, and training facilities that continuously expanded America's pool of industrial talent. The American automotive industry has essentially created its own educational system, wrote labor attaché Hideo Noguchi in April 1934. Workers develop specialized skills through formal training rather than traditional apprenticeship alone. This systematic approach to workforce development creates industrial capabilities that extend far beyond the specific companies providing the training. These workforce capabilities particularly concerned Japanese military analysts, who recognized that industrial warfare required not just factories but skilled workers capable of operating them. America's automotive industry had created a deep reservoir of manufacturing talent that could be redirected to military production if necessary. Machinists, tool and die makers, metallurgists, industrial engineers, and production managers with transferable skills. Equally impressive to Japanese observers was the speed of technological innovation within America's automotive sector. Between 1930 and 1934, American automobiles incorporated significant technological improvements each year: more powerful engines, improved suspension systems, better braking technology, and enhanced reliability. This rapid iteration demonstrated an industrial capacity for continuous improvement that had obvious military implications. The pace of American automotive innovation reveals a technological dynamism that must be factored into strategic calculations, wrote technical analyst Shiro Ishikawa in June 1934. Each model year brings meaningful improvements rather than merely cosmetic changes. This capacity for rapid technological evolution would apply equally to military equipment in wartime conditions. The automotive industry had also driven significant innovations in material science and application. Japanese observers noted American manufacturers' sophisticated use of alloy steels, aluminum components, synthetic rubbers, and specialized lubricants. These material innovations had obvious applications beyond automobile manufacturing, particularly in aircraft and naval equipment, where weight, durability, and performance characteristics were critically important. American automotive engineers have essentially created a vast materials laboratory, testing and refining new alloys and compounds under real-world conditions, noted materials scientist Keiichiro Takahashi in August 1934. This practical materials knowledge represents a strategic resource of immense value that could be rapidly applied to military applications if necessary. The financial dimensions of America's automotive revolution were equally significant. By 1934, automotive-related businesses accounted for approximately 1/6 of all American wholesale and retail trade. The industry had developed sophisticated financing mechanisms, insurance products, and service networks that supported mass automobile ownership even during economic depression. This financial infrastructure represented another form of industrial resilience that Japanese observers noted with concern. The Americans have created not just automotive technology, but automotive financial systems that maintain demand even during economic hardship, wrote financial analyst Hachiro Arita in September 1934. Their installment purchasing arrangements, service contracts, and trade-in systems create a self-sustaining market that keeps their industrial capacity fully engaged despite broader economic challenges. Perhaps most concerning to Japanese analysts was the relationship between America's automotive industry and its petroleum sector. By 1934, America produced approximately 65% of the world's petroleum, with vast domestic reserves and sophisticated refining capabilities. This abundant domestic oil supply provided both economic and strategic advantages that Japan, dependent on imported petroleum, could not match. America's automotive and petroleum industries have evolved in tandem, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of development, wrote energy analyst Takeo Kato in October 1934. Abundant domestic petroleum makes mass automobile ownership economically feasible, while mass automobile ownership creates demand that stimulates petroleum production and refining innovations. This synergistic relationship represents a strategic advantage of incalculable value. The petroleum disparity between Japan and the United States had become a central strategic concern by late 1934. As Japan's military influence grew within its government, securing reliable petroleum supplies emerged as a key strategic objective. Without significant domestic oil production, Japan remained vulnerable to potential petroleum embargoes that could immobilize both civilian transportation and military operations. This vulnerability would ultimately influence Japan's expansion into Southeast Asia, where petroleum resources in the Dutch East Indies, modern Indonesia, represented a potential solution to Japan's oil dependence. The strategic implications of America's automotive petroleum complex thus extended far beyond transportation technology to shape territorial ambitions and military planning throughout the Pacific region. By the end of 1934, Japanese diplomatic and industrial reports on America's automotive revolution had synthesized into a comprehensive assessment with profound strategic implications. These reports recognized that automobile production represented not just an industrial sector, but a fundamental national capability that encompassed manufacturing expertise, technical workforce development, material innovation, financial systems, and resource utilization. This assessment influenced Japan's industrial development strategy in the years that followed. Rather than attempting to match America's automotive production directly, a practical impossibility given resource and market constraints, Japan focused on developing specialized industrial capabilities that might provide asymmetric advantages. Precision manufacturing, miniaturization, and optical technology became particular areas of emphasis, building on traditional Japanese craftsmanship while incorporating modern industrial methods. The automotive gap also influenced Japan's military procurement strategy. Recognizing that Japan could not match American production volumes, military planners emphasized quality over quantity, particularly in aircraft and naval vessels, where technological advantages might potentially offset numerical inferiority. This approach reflected a clear-eyed assessment of industrial realities rather than cultural preferences alone. For ordinary Japanese citizens, however, America's automotive revolution remained a distant phenomenon throughout the 1930s. While government officials and industrial experts carefully studied Detroit's assembly lines, most Japanese experienced daily transportation much as their parents and grandparents had, walking, bicycling, using horse-drawn vehicles, or riding electric streetcars and trains in urban areas. Automobile ownership remained largely limited to government agencies, commercial enterprises, and the wealthy elite. This transportation disparity became increasingly evident to Japanese citizens through American movies, magazines, and other cultural imports that frequently featured automobiles as both background elements and central plot devices. Hollywood films showing ordinary American families driving their own cars presented a vision of middle-class prosperity that contrasted sharply with Japanese transportation realities. American films show a world where even ordinary workers possess their own automobiles, wrote cultural commentator Haruo Sato in early 1935. These images convey American prosperity more effectively than economic statistics ever could. To Japanese viewers, the ubiquitous American automobile represents not just transportation, but a different conception of what ordinary life might contain. This perception contributed to complex attitudes toward America among ordinary Japanese citizens in the pre-war period. American industrial achievements, particularly in automotive technology, inspired both admiration and concern. Recognition of remarkable technological accomplishment, coupled with awareness of the strategic implications this industrial gap created as international tensions increased. For American officials, by contrast, Japan's intense study of their automotive ecosystem remained largely unnoticed throughout the 1930s. While diplomatic and military intelligence focused on Japan's naval construction, territorial ambitions, and political developments, little attention was paid to Japanese industrial observers touring Detroit factories, attending automotive trade shows, and meticulously documenting America's transportation transformation. This intelligence asymmetry would prove significant in the years ahead. Japan developed its war plans with a clear understanding of America's industrial capacity and conversion potential. While American military planners initially underestimated Japan's technical capabilities and strategic planning. The automotive gap between the nations represented just one aspect of this broader intelligence picture, but Japanese observations of America's four-wheeled revolution provided valuable insights into industrial capacity, resource utilization, and social organization that informed strategic thinking as the world moved toward global conflict. As the prospect of Pacific conflict grew more likely in the late 1930s, Japanese strategic planners incorporated their understanding of America's automotive industrial complex into war planning. This planning recognized a fundamental reality: Japan could not match America's industrial output in a prolonged conflict. Any successful strategy would therefore require decisive early victories that might force a negotiated settlement before America's superior industrial capacity could be fully mobilized for war production. This recognition influenced Japan's emphasis on naval aviation and carrier warfare, capabilities that might potentially neutralize American advantages through decisive strikes rather than sustained industrial competition. It also shaped Japan's territorial ambitions in the Pacific, particularly regarding resource-rich regions that might reduce strategic vulnerabilities in critical materials like petroleum, rubber, and various metals essential to modern industrial production. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 represented the culmination of this strategic thinking, an attempt to neutralize American naval power through a decisive strike while simultaneously securing resource-rich territories throughout the Pacific region. The strategic calculus behind this attack incorporated detailed understanding of America's industrial capabilities, including the automotive sector that Japanese observers had so meticulously studied throughout the previous decade. What Japanese planners failed to fully anticipate, however, was the speed and scale with which America's automotive industry could convert to military production. Within months of Pearl Harbor, automobile manufacturers had completely transformed their operations to produce aircraft, tanks, trucks, jeeps, and other military equipment. Assembly lines that had produced civilian cars in December 1941 were turning out bombers, fighter planes, and armored vehicles by mid-1942. This industrial conversion occurred with remarkable speed precisely because the fundamental manufacturing capabilities, machine tools, production engineering, workforce skills, and management systems transferred readily from automotive to military production. The industrial ecosystem that Japanese observers had so carefully documented proved even more adaptable than they had anticipated, rapidly reorienting toward war production while maintaining extraordinary output volumes. Ford's massive Willow Run plant in Michigan exemplified this conversion capability. Originally designed to produce automobiles, the facility was rapidly converted to manufacture B-24 Liberator bombers. By 1944, the plant was producing one complete bomber every hour, applying automotive mass production techniques to aircraft manufacturing with unprecedented results. Similar conversions occurred throughout America's automotive industry, creating what President Roosevelt described as the arsenal of democracy. The war years transformed America's automotive industry in ways that would have long-term consequences for both nations. Military production accelerated technological innovation, particularly in material science, precision manufacturing, and production engineering. Automotive companies developed new alloys, manufacturing techniques, and quality control methods under the pressure of wartime production that would later benefit civilian automobile manufacturing when peace returned. For Japan, the Pacific War confirmed the strategic assessments that diplomatic and industrial observers had developed throughout the 1930s. America's industrial capacity, with the automotive sector as a crucial component, proved decisive in the conflict exactly as Japanese analysts had feared. The war's outcome demonstrated that industrial capability ultimately trumped tactical advantages or initial victories in modern mechanized warfare. When peace returned in 1945, both nations faced transportation systems transformed by war. America's civilian automobile fleet had aged significantly during the production freeze from 1942 to 1945, creating enormous pent-up demand for new vehicles. Japan's limited automotive infrastructure had been largely destroyed by strategic bombing, requiring complete reconstruction under American occupation authorities. This post-war period created unexpected opportunities for Japanese industrial development. American occupation policies encouraged Japan's economic reconstruction, including industrial development, that might reduce occupation costs and create a stable democratic ally in the Pacific region. Automotive manufacturing, which American authorities understood as fundamental to modern industrial economies, received particular support through technical assistance programs and favorable regulatory policies. Japanese industrial leaders, many of whom had studied America's automotive ecosystem as observers in the pre-war period, applied these lessons to Japan's post-war reconstruction. Rather than simply imitating American automotive models, however, they adapted manufacturing techniques to Japan's specific circumstances, limited domestic market size, resource constraints, and different transportation needs. Toyota Motor Corporation exemplified this adaptive approach. Founded by Kiichiro Toyota, who had personally studied Ford's production system in the early 1930s, Toyota developed manufacturing techniques that emphasized efficiency, minimal waste, and continuous improvement, rather than sheer production volume. This approach, later known as the Toyota Production System, represented not simple imitation, but creative adaptation of American manufacturing principles to Japanese conditions. Similar adaptive approaches characterized other Japanese automotive manufacturers that emerged in the post-war period. Companies like Honda, Nissan, and Mazda incorporated lessons from America's automotive revolution while developing distinctive approaches suited to Japan's domestic market and potential export opportunities. This combination of learned principles and adaptive innovation would ultimately transform Japan from automotive student to teacher in the decades that followed. The post-war recovery of both nations' automotive sectors followed dramatically different trajectories. America's automobile industry boomed in the late 1940s and throughout the 1950s, with production reaching unprecedented volumes as manufacturers satisfied pent-up domestic demand. Road construction accelerated with the Interstate Highway Act of 1956, further expanding America's automotive ecosystem and cementing the automobile's central role in American life. Japan's automotive industry, by contrast, followed a more measured development path. Domestic production increased steadily, but remained focused on vehicles suited to Japan's specific needs: small, fuel-efficient cars for urban environments, practical trucks for commercial applications, and specialized vehicles for Japan's narrow roads and limited parking spaces. This developmental approach emphasized practical transportation rather than the status and luxury dimensions that characterized much of America's automotive market. By the early 1960s, however, Japanese manufacturers began looking beyond their domestic market toward export opportunities. With limited domestic growth potential due to Japan's population density and excellent public transportation, expansion required reaching foreign customers. America, with its massive automotive market and consumers increasingly interested in smaller, more economical vehicles, represented the primary target for this export strategy. The oil crises of the 1970s accelerated this market penetration. As petroleum prices spiked and supply uncertainties grew, American consumers increasingly valued the fuel efficiency that Japanese manufacturers had emphasized since their inception. Vehicles designed for Japan's resource constraints suddenly found ready acceptance in an American market facing similar constraints for the first time in its automotive history. This market shift represented a remarkable historical irony. The automotive gap that Japanese diplomats had observed with such concern in 1930 had transformed over 4 decades into a comparative advantage. Japanese manufacturers who had studied America's automotive revolution as outside observers were now reshaping America's automotive market through vehicles specifically designed for a resource-constrained world that Detroit had never anticipated. The competitive challenges that Japanese imports posed to American manufacturers in the 1970s and 1980s triggered significant soul-searching within America's automotive industry. Declining market share, quality problems, and financial difficulties forced fundamental reconsideration of manufacturing techniques, design priorities, and customer relationships. Many American manufacturers explicitly studied Japanese production methods, particularly the Toyota production system, seeking to incorporate these approaches into their own operations. This knowledge transfer represented another historical irony: American manufacturers learning from Japanese companies that had themselves studied American production techniques 4 decades earlier. The circular nature of this knowledge exchange demonstrated how industrial expertise flows between nations in complex patterns of learning, adaptation, and reinvention, rather than simple imitation. By the 1980s, Japanese automobile manufacturers had established significant production facilities within the United States itself, completing a remarkable historical cycle that had begun with those astonished Japanese diplomats observing America's streets in 1930. Companies like Honda, Toyota, and Nissan built modern manufacturing facilities in states like Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee, employing American workers while incorporating Japanese production methods adapted from earlier American innovations. These transplant factories represented more than simple manufacturing relocation. They functioned as cultural exchange points where Japanese management techniques and American workforce traditions created hybrid approaches to automotive production. American workers learned Kanban inventory systems and quality circles, while Japanese managers adapted to American labor practices and community relationships. The resulting manufacturing culture combined elements from both traditions in ways neither nation could have anticipated in the pre-war period. For historians studying this remarkable transformation, the detailed observations recorded by Japanese diplomats and industrial observers in the early 1930s provide invaluable documentation of America's automotive revolution from an outside perspective. These reports capture not just technical details, but cultural impressions, strategic assessments, and economic analyses that reveal how thoroughly Japanese observers understood the significance of America's four-wheeled transformation even as it was occurring. Ambassador Debussy's archived papers, preserved in Japan's diplomatic archives, contain particularly insightful observations about how automobiles had transformed American social relationships. The American automobile has altered not just transportation but social interaction itself, he wrote in 1932. Family structures, courtship practices, community relationships, and work patterns have all been reshaped by this technology. Americans increasingly define freedom itself in automotive terms, the ability to go where they wish, when they wish, independent of fixed schedules or routes. This observation proved remarkably prescient. Throughout the post-war period, automobile ownership remained central to American conceptions of personal freedom and social status, despite changing economic circumstances and growing environmental concerns. The cultural significance that Japanese observers had recognized in 1930 proved more durable than even the specific automotive technologies or companies of that era. For Japan, the lessons learned through studying America's automotive revolution ultimately contributed to its own distinctive automotive culture that emerged in the post-war period. Rather than simply replicating American patterns of automobile use, Japan developed an automotive ecosystem that complemented its excellent public transportation systems, accommodated its dense urban environments, and reflected its resource constraints. This adaptive approach characterized Japanese automotive development throughout the post-war period. Manufacturers emphasized fuel efficiency decades before environmental concerns made this a global priority. Vehicle designs accommodated Japan's narrow streets and limited parking. Distribution systems worked within Japan's complex retail traditions rather than imposing American sales models. The resulting automotive ecosystem represented not imitation, but thoughtful adaptation of fundamental principles to specific national circumstances. The transformation of Japan from automotive observer to automotive innovator represents one of the most remarkable industrial developments of the 20th century. In 1930, when Japanese diplomats watched in amazement as endless streams of automobiles filled America's streets, Japan produced fewer than 500 vehicles annually. By 2000, Japanese manufacturers produced approximately 10 million vehicles per year and had pioneered manufacturing techniques, quality control systems, and environmental technologies that influenced automotive production worldwide. This transformation was neither accidental nor inevitable. It resulted from conscious decisions to study, adapt, and improve upon industrial models observed during that critical pre-war period when Japanese diplomats and industrial experts documented America's automotive revolution in such meticulous detail. The resulting knowledge transfer, interrupted by war but resumed during occupation and Reconstruction, fundamentally shaped Japan's industrial development for generations. For American automobile manufacturers, the emergence of Japanese competition in the 1970s and 1980s triggered painful but ultimately beneficial adaptations. Quality improvement initiatives, manufacturing efficiency programs, and renewed emphasis on customer satisfaction helped American companies regain competitive position in domestic and global markets. The resulting industry, while different from its mid-century dominance, maintained significant production capacity, technical innovation, and cultural influence. The automotive relationship between Japan and the United States thus evolved from one-sided observation to complex interdependence over the course of 7 decades. Technologies, manufacturing methods, design approaches, and management techniques flowed in both directions, creating automotive industries in both nations that reflected this ongoing exchange. Vehicles produced in either country incorporated components, technologies, and design influences from the other, creating truly global products despite their national brand identities. This evolution reflected broader changes in the relationship between the two nations. From pre-war rivalry through wartime conflict to post-war alliance and economic competition, the Japan-America relationship transformed multiple times throughout the 20th century. The automotive connection between the nations reflected these broader changes while simultaneously helping to shape their economic and cultural relationships. For the Japanese diplomats who had stood transfixed on American street corners in 1930, watching in amazement as rivers of automobiles flowed past, this future relationship would have been impossible to imagine. Their immediate concern focused on the strategic implications of America's automotive industrial capacity as international tensions increased. The possibility that Japanese companies might someday build automobiles in American factories, or that American manufacturers would study Japanese production methods, lay beyond any reasonable prediction. Yet the detailed observations these diplomats recorded contained the seeds of this future relationship. By documenting not just America's automotive technology, but its manufacturing systems, industrial organization, workforce development, and cultural impacts, Japanese observers captured fundamental principles that transcended specific historical circumstances. These principles, standardization, continuous improvement, workforce skill development, integrated supply chains, would prove relevant across national boundaries and throughout decades of industrial evolution. The story of Japanese diplomatic observations of America's automotive revolution thus represents more than a historical curiosity. It illustrates how industrial knowledge transfers between nations, how technological revolutions transform societies beyond their immediate applications, and how strategic advantages in one era can shift dramatically in another. Above all, it demonstrates how careful observation and analysis can identify significant developments even as they occur, providing strategic insights that shape decisions for generations to come. As we conclude this examination of Japanese diplomatic reactions to America's automotive revolution, several enduring lessons emerge. First, technological transformations rarely remain confined to their country of origin. Knowledge, techniques, and innovations inevitably cross national boundaries through observation, adaptation, and reimagination. Second, industrial capabilities represent strategic assets whose significance extends far beyond economic metrics to shape military potential, resource priorities, and international relationships. Finally, the most profound technological revolutions transform not just material circumstances, but cultural values, social relationships, and national self-perception in ways that persist long after the original technologies have evolved. The astonished Japanese diplomats who documented America's streets filled with automobiles in 1930 could not have anticipated how thoroughly automotive technology would transform both nations over the following century. Yet their meticulous observations captured a pivotal moment in industrial history when America's four-wheeled revolution was reshaping not just transportation, but society itself. Their reports, preserved in diplomatic archives and industrial records, provide an invaluable outside perspective on a technological transformation that Americans themselves often took for granted, a moment when the future arrived on four wheels, one assembly line at a time. Today, as both nations face new technological revolutions in vehicle electrification, autonomous driving, and mobility services, the historical lessons of this earlier transformation remain relevant. Technological leadership continues to shift between nations through complex patterns of innovation, adaptation, and reimagination. Industrial capabilities continue to shape strategic relationships and national priorities. And transportation technologies continue to transform not just how people move, but how they live, work, and relate to one another in ways that extend far beyond mere mobility. The Japanese diplomats who watched in amazement as America's streets filled with automobiles in 1930 were witnessing not just a transportation revolution, but the emergence of a new industrial era that would ultimately transform both nations. Their observations, recorded in diplomatic cables and reports now yellowed with age, captured a pivotal moment when the future arrived on America's streets. A future that would eventually reshape Japan's own industrial destiny in ways they could scarcely have imagined as they stood on those American street corners, counting the endless parade of automobiles flowing past, one automotive revolution becoming the seed of another yet to come.